In the 90s and 2000s, Nickelodeon was one of the most popular children networks on TV. Shows like All That, Kenan and Kel, The Amanda Show, Drake and Josh, and many more were responsible for growing the network to the giant it became. With millions of kids tuning in day after day to watch their favorite kid-friendly programming, Nickelodeon was only getting bigger. They had the kids of the world in the palms of their hands. The problem with this is that it's finally being exposed just exactly what Nick was doing to those kids they had so much power over. While Nick operated under this child-friendly banner, it is now becoming apparent there was nothing ever child-friendly about Nickelodeon. Hey guys, I hope all is well. Welcome to The Truth Is, where I drop new videos every other day exposing the truth. In today's episode, we will be talking about the dark fall of Nickelodeon and going over the recent documentary Quiet on Set. Let's get right into it. The kids of the 90s and 2000s were no doubt heavily influenced by the shows they watched on Nickelodeon. Kids all over the country watched these TV shows and idolized these stars on them. I myself was one of the kids watching Nick, thinking to myself, these child actors have such an awesome life. I wanted to have their life. They were famous, they were on TV, and their life seemed so much fun. Little did I know what these child stars were being put through to be on these shows. For the longest, no one ever talked about Hollywood's biggest problem, which is children in the industry. No one in Hollywood or those watching what Hollywood made spoke about what took place in the industry. Even though everyone has heard the stories of what happens to kid stars in the industry, it seems that they turn a blind eye and continue to enjoy their Hollywood programming. Now that the industry's dark secrets are finally spilling out, people have started to see the disturbing reality these child stars were exposed to. Just a few days back, the docu-series Quiet on Set was released, and for the first time, America was being forced to watch this unsettling truth about children in Hollywood. Finally, the facade Hollywood painted for themselves was exposed, and the sick intentions of the industry executives are unveiled. In today's episode, we're gonna go over some of the things the documentary revealed about what the Nickelodeon executives were doing to these young child stars. I must say, the first thing I noticed instantly was that all the people who were a part of the documentary exposing Nickelodeon were people who are no longer in the industry. All the child actors they spoke to were former actors who didn't have active careers today. Actors that were all shunned from the industry at one point or another. Those that were a part of Nick that went on to become superstars as adults did not appear in the docuseries. These big stars are either complicit with what's going on or afraid of talking out in fear of retaliation. No one who is in Hollywood enjoying the perks of the industry are going to risk what they have speaking out. Even though they all see the evil, they took the silent oath of secrecy, vowing to protect the industry's secrets. People like Ariana Grande, Kenan Thompson, and Nick Cannon all went on to be massively successful after Nick and are still in the industry. All three of these people were around Dan, working on the same shows where Dan was doing inappropriate things. So it's obvious they saw it all go down, but they just won't speak out. This matches with a point made in the docuseries when they speak about a man named Brian Peck, who was a convicted P-word who was arrested for inappropriate behavior with one of the actors that were still under 18. In one scene, the documentary makes it clear that many big names in Hollywood came out in support of Brian Peck, even though there was undeniable evidence he was guilty. His peers in the industry asked the judge for leniency for his sentencing. One woman in particular, Beth Carell, who was an assistant director on shows like All That and later The Sweet Life of Zack and Cody, was one of the people accused in the documentary of supporting Brian Peck even after his conviction, going as far as to hire Brian to work on Disney Channel on The Sweet Life of Zack and Cody. This was after Brian Peck was convicted for his terrible crimes. Disney and Beth felt it would be a great idea to hire him to work around more children, even after what he did. We're not done talking about Brian Peck yet, as we will be discussing much more about him in a bit. What people like Beth Carell proved to us is that these people have each other's back no matter what. They know about the evil that goes on in the industry, but they choose to keep quiet and hide it from coming out. Those who choose to talk about the industry are forever cast out, and they will never be accepted back in. One thing the documentary presented was the inappropriate jokes the children were meant to act out for the shows. For instance, the documentary highlights several instances where they made these young actors simulate inappropriate activities during comedy sketches that were made by Dan Schneider and his team. Sketches that show goo being squirted on these young actors' face to represent an inappropriate adult sexual act. The documentary referred to many instances of this blatant behavior taking place. For example, they pointed out one sketch of a young boy who played the character Noseboy in one of the sketches. Noseboy plays the character of a superhero who wore a massive prosthetic nose. The superhero costume was decorated with two large penises on each side of the costume. During one part of the sketch, Noseboy sneezes and his snot lands on another actor's face. The joke was obviously supposed to represent an inappropriate act that was not acceptable for children to act out or for children to watch. Many inappropriate scenes were presented like this one of Ariana Grande squeezing a potato while making inappropriate noises, claiming she's trying to squeeze the juice out of it. Scenes that were clearly created to represent adult activities. There were many inappropriate moments in the many shows Dan Schneider was behind on Nickelodeon. Behavior that he tried to write off in this interview by saying it was approved by the higher-ups at the company and that parents were present when it was all happening, claiming that none of them had a problem with it and that the jokes were funny to kids and not supposed to be sexual.
You've written hundreds of episodes. Thousands of jokes have been told. Yeah. But currently where we are, some people think that some of those jokes are inappropriate for children. What do you think of that?
All these jokes that, speaking of, that the show covered over the past 2 nights, every one of those jokes was written for a kid audience because kids thought they were funny and only funny, okay? Now we have some adults looking back at them 20 years later through their lens, and they're looking at them and they're saying, I don't think that's appropriate for a kid show. And I have no problem with that. If that's how anyone feels, let's cut those jokes out of the show. Just like I would have done 20 years ago or 25 years ago. I cut it. I want my shows to be popular. I want everyone to like it. The more people who like the shows, the happier I am. So if there's anything in a show that needs to be cut because it's upsetting somebody, let's cut it.
So I think it's big for you to say with your work, if it's viewed as that today, you don't have a problem.
Cut it. Cut it.
I mean, that's a solution.
The last thing I want to ever do is put any content in a show that's going to upset my audience and make them want to turn off the TV. Why would I ever want to do that?
That makes sense. I want to give you an opportunity to kind of elaborate on something.
Okay.
The thought process for the series is you had the power to just write a joke, and no matter what, it's going on TV. You just had that type of power. Is that true?
The notion that I had the power to just do whatever I wanted and have it air is completely false.
Okay.
There were many, many levels of scrutiny. Okay? We had executives in LA. We had executives in New York.
Two coasts.
Two coasts of approval. Coasts. Yes. And by the way, approval at every stage, really. Okay. I'm talking about wardrobe. I'm talking about makeup, sound, sets, dialogue, jokes, everything.
Now, when you say approval, these obviously that's a hierarchy, not your colleagues or people in the room. Okay.
No, not my colleagues. No, these are my bosses. Bosses, and then their bosses, and then their bosses. And they're approving all of this stuff. Okay? And we're also shooting it in front of all sorts of adults and caregivers and the set teacher and the families. Everybody's watching it. And if anybody had said anything, hey, we don't like that, that's not appropriate, it would have been cut out.
All of this just proves all of Hollywood, including the parents who sell out their children, are complicit in this behavior. This is the reason they didn't call him out. Dan Schneider was behind the many scenes that were wrong in so many ways. Still, Nickelodeon paid him millions and made him a king of kids. The reason they snuck these inappropriate jokes in children's shows was to be able to groom and introduce these ideas to children young in order to corrupt them, all while satisfying people like Dan and other executives' dark fantasies. By showing these children inappropriate behavior, they are able to introduce them to these adult concepts earlier than usual, allowing these kids to be easily targeted by people like Dan and Brian to participate in inappropriate conduct. A lot of things were mentioned about Dan Schneider, but what stuck out to me the most was his relationship with the TV show stars he made. Dan was responsible for many children's shows with female main leads, like The Amanda Show, iCarly, Sam and Cat, Victorious, and a few others. In each one of these shows, it appears that Dan had what looks to be an inappropriately close relationship with all the young female leads. In the documentary, they made it clear that Dan and Amanda Bynes seemed to have had an inappropriate relationship together, claiming they were spotted spending an awful lot of private time together before she got The Amanda Show when Amanda was still working on all that. It's the same with Dan Schneider and Miranda Cosgrove's relationship, another young girl who was close to him before he granted her own TV show iCarly. Or even Dan and Ariana Grande, who were also seen close together before he gave her own show Sam and Cat. Each time, Dan appeared to become inappropriately close to these young female actors, spending tons of private times with them. He gave them their own show. We can find Dan sitting in hot tubs with these young girls, having them sit on his lap, or forcing them to give him hugs. It's obvious Dan wanted something from these girls before he granted them their own hit TV show and made them stars. In the documentary, they speak about the strange relationship Dan had with Amanda in great detail. One incident they mentioned was a time Amanda has snuck out of her house in the middle of the night in order to go visit Dan Schneider. Dan denied her going to his house but admitted he did speak to her that night and had someone pick her up and drop her off at the police station. Another incident they mentioned was a time when Dan was trying to have Amanda emancipated in order to distance her from her parents. This is a technique that many of these P-word use. They try to isolate the child in order to do what they want to them without being caught. Even though the emancipation was denied, Dan still got the control he wanted over Amanda, as her parents had sold her to the industry and didn't care what she did as long as she made the money. What Dan was doing was a form of initiation on these young child stars, making them compromise themselves for an opportunity at their own show, hoping they can become stars. This is the same practice that happens in Hollywood to adult stars as well, but it becomes even more sick when it's done to children. The main incident in the docuseries was about the story of what happened to Drake Bell, one of the stars from Dan Schneider's hit show called Drake and Josh. In the docuseries, they talk about an incident that took place between Drake and the dialect coach on All That, Brian Peck. For the longest time, it was known that Brian Peck was convicted of crimes against 2 young actors from the All That cast. He was let go from Nickelodeon for these crimes, but since his victims were under 18, their names were kept hidden from the public, so no one knew who his victims were. This was until this new docuseries that revealed exactly who one of Brian Peck's victims was, and it was no other than Drake Bell. According to Drake Bell, he was groomed and taken advantage by Brian, which he met while working on the set of All That. Brian quickly took a liking to Drake, and this is when all the trouble began. Drake claims it started with Brian being touchy with him during sets, which was noticed by his father, who was his manager. His father would bring this up to the Nickelodeon staff, but they brushed it off as nothing. This is when Brian began trying to separate Drake from his dad. He would go on to plant seeds of confusion in Drake's mind to make him question his dad and distance himself from him, which he eventually did. Eventually, Brian would convince Drake to drop his father as his manager. He then began to gain the trust of his mother, only to be able to get Drake alone, to allow him to do whatever he wanted to him. One day, Brian told Drake's mother that he was going to stay over at his house because the studio was hours away from their home, and Brian lived close to the studios, so it would be easier for Drake to make it on time. When the mother agreed and Brian got access to Drake by himself, he did really evil things to him that no child should experience. He violated Drake in every disturbing way possible. This behavior would take place after the situation multiple times for a long period of time. Soon after Drake was taken advantage of by Brian, he will star in his own show Drake and Josh, a show that even after Drake was put through disturbing incidents with Brian, he acted in. While Drake was the lead of this massive show, he was dealing with the torment of what he was put through by Brian Peck to get the show in the first place. The reason I believe Nickelodeon made sure the Drake and Josh show still happened was to keep Drake happy and stop him from exposing the company, which he did. They kept him from coming out to the world by letting him live out his dreams. Like I said earlier, even after Brian was arrested and served time for the crimes he did against Drake and other child actors, Disney still hired him and allowed them to work around children once again. One thing that was made clear in this documentary was that none of those in Hollywood truly care about the kids in the industry, not even the kids' parents. These parents whose children got taken advantage of let it happen because they didn't want their child to be removed from the show and lose the money they made. Or they were complicit in a part of the Hollywood problem. If you ever wonder why Hollywood is so corrupted, it's because of one reason. Like I mentioned many times before, Hollywood is controlled by the occult. These big executives and producers are occultists who are involved in occult rituals using children. The infamous occultist Aleister Crowley spoke about using children for his sex rituals. This is exactly what men like Brian Peck and many others in Hollywood are into. This is why Hollywood protected Brian Peck and Dan Schneider, because they all do it in the industry and they got each other's back. I confidently believe many of these star actors used on Disney Channel or Nickelodeon were children they got straight out of the Demolay Masonic Organization for boys or the Rainbow Masonic Organization. Both organizations or Masonic occult groups focused on grooming children to be occultists in adulthood. I believe they trained those children to keep quiet and not snitch on fellow members of what they're put through. The docuseries made it clear that Hollywood has a serious problem that needs to be solved immediately. Children do not belong in Hollywood as it's the devil's playground. Even though all the parents know this, they still choose to sell their children to Hollywood in order to get what they want from the industry. We must stop allowing this evil to take place in our world and stop turning a blind eye. The children need to be protected at all costs. The story of Drake Bell is a perfect example of what these children are put through to become stars. He had to compromise himself to have it all, and that's the price of fame. It's important to note that Drake was later accused of doing something similar to a girl he was mentoring. Drake would eventually plead guilty to charges that stated he sent inappropriate messages to this young girl. While he pleaded out and is free today, it shows what he was put through as a child made him want to do it to others. Hollywood is full of children like Drake Bell who grew up to go on and hurt others like they hurt him. Well, that's it for this video. But before you guys go, I just wanted to ask you to please like, comment, and share this video so that it would be recommended to others. I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.